During a routine training exercise in the snowy mountains, a team of canine German shepherds stumbled upon something that would forever change their lives, and the life of a man they didn't even know. Their handler had been distracted for just a moment, losing sight of them as the dogs veered off into the deep woods. At first, there was nothing but the howling wind and the steady crunch of snow beneath their paws, but then they saw him. A man, barely conscious, bloodied and bruised, hanging helplessly from a frozen tree, his wrists bound with thick chains cutting into his skin. The man was Thomas Grady, a forest ranger, who had been left for dead in the middle of nowhere after refusing to comply with a group of criminals seeking illegal access to the reserve. For Thomas, time seemed to stand still. The bitter cold had already begun to numb his senses, and his mind was slipping in and out of consciousness, barely holding onto the edge of life. His uniform was soaked in a mixture of blood and melting snow, and his wrists were raw from struggling against the chains. He could no longer feel his fingers, nor could he hold on to the fading hope that anyone would come to save him. His breath came in short, labored bursts as he clung to life, staring into the snowy void, praying for a miracle. But what Thomas didn't know was that his miracle was about to arrive, not from the humans he had trusted to protect him, but from a pack of dogs. The canine German shepherds, driven by nothing but instinct and loyalty, had found him. At first, panic surged through Thomas as he saw dark figures moving swiftly through the trees, thinking they were wolves. He remembered his survival training, telling himself to stay still and not show fear. But as the figures drew closer, he realized they weren't wild predators. They were dogs, trained, disciplined, and on a mission. One of them, larger than the rest, stepped forward, sniffing the air. Thomas, weak and barely able to speak, whispered a shaky "good boys," his voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. The dogs didn't bark or growl. Instead, they moved with a precision that could only be described as tactical. They knew exactly what to do. One began circling the area, another sniffed at the base of the tree, while the larger dog, the alpha, went straight for the chains. He barked once, a sharp and urgent sound that echoed through the stillness of the woods. The dogs weren't lost. They weren't confused. They were trained for moments like this. As Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, the dogs continued their work, each movement deliberate and full of purpose. In those moments, the bond between man and dog became something deeper than words, a silent understanding that no one could have predicted. Back at the rescue base, the atmosphere had shifted from organized urgency to quiet panic. The sudden disappearance of the K-9 unit had set off alarm bells among the team, but no one was more shaken than Officer Daniels, the handler who had trained and loved those dogs like family. He paced back and forth, jaw clenched, his gloved hands gripping the radio as he repeatedly called out into the static, "Echo team, report your location. Come in." Each unanswered call only deepened the knot in his stomach. These dogs weren't just trained, they were disciplined to the core. They didn't go rogue. If they'd left the assigned area, it meant something had drawn them away, something serious. Daniel's heart sank. He knew them too well to believe this was a simple error. When the base technician finally managed to lock onto a faint GPS ping from one of the dog's trackers, it felt like a lifeline. Without hesitation, Daniels jumped on the nearest snowmobile, the wind screaming in his ears as he tore off into the white void, clutching the device tightly, eyes locked on the blinking signal. The cold bit into his skin through layers of gear, but he didn't care. His breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, more from dread than the freezing air. Every bump in the snow made him grip tighter. He didn't know what he was about to find, but he feared the worst. The terrain grew harsher, the wind more violent. Snow swirled like a living thing, trying to push him back. But then, through the blizzard, he heard it. A bark. Then another. Short, sharp, urgent. It sliced through the storm like a flare. Daniels veered in that direction, adrenaline flooding his system. As he drew closer, shapes began to form, a cluster of dogs at the base of a tree, barking and circling with purpose. Then his eyes locked on something that made his blood run cold. Hanging from the tree was a man. His body limp, arms bound above his head with thick chains now frozen solid. The blood on the snow beneath him was dark and stark against the white. Daniel's breath caught. "Oh God," he whispered, leaping off the snowmobile and rushing forward. His knees hit the snow hard, but he barely felt it. His fingers scrambled for the chains, trying to work them loose, the cold burning his skin. "Stay with me. Stay with me, man," he muttered, voice cracking, panic seeping into every word. The dogs watched, still and silent now, their job done, their eyes never leaving Thomas. In that moment, the storm seemed to pause. There was only the sound of Daniel's frantic movements, the hiss of his breath, and the heavy silence of a man on the edge between life and death. But Daniels wasn't going to let go. Not when those dogs had come this far. Not when there was still a chance to save him. Thomas was barely clinging to life as they carried him into the emergency tent. His body was stiff with cold, lips a haunting shade of blue, and his skin ghostly pale from hours, maybe days, of exposure. Every breath he took was shallow, ragged, like a whisper fighting to stay alive. The medical team jumped into action, their movements a blur of urgency. They stripped away his soaked, frozen clothes, revealing bruises, cuts, and raw skin where the chains had bitten into his wrists. One nurse's hand paused for just a second at the sight, a flicker of horror flashing in her eyes before she continued. Thermal blankets were wrapped tightly around him, for lines inserted, heaters blasted into the tent. But even with all the warmth, the cold had sunk deep, not just into Thomas's body, but into the hearts of those watching. Just outside the entrance, the rescue dogs stood soaked and panting, refusing to move. Their fur was matted with snow and mud, but their eyes never left Thomas. One of them, Rex, the grizzled old shepherd who had led the team to him, let out a soft, pained whine, as if begging the man not to slip away. Officer Daniel stood nearby, his breath still catching in his throat. The adrenaline from the rescue had begun to fade, but a storm of emotion churned within him, rage, sorrow, disbelief. He stared at Thomas's frail body, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "They left him to die," he said hoarsely, voice thick with emotion. "Like an animal. No food. No warmth. Just chains and silence." The doctor didn't respond, his attention was on the monitors and vital signs, but Daniel's words hung heavy in the room. Every medic there could feel the weight of them. How could someone do this? How had this man survived at all? Then, a flicker, Thomas's fingers twitched ever so slightly, barely perceptible. But Daniel saw it. He rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the cot, gently taking Thomas's cold, bandaged hand in his own. "Hey, Thomas, you're safe now," he whispered, voice cracking. "You're not alone. We found you. You made it." Thomas's eyes fluttered for a moment, as if trying to open, but they remained shut. His lips moved, but no sound came. Still, it was enough. A sign of life. A will to fight. Outside, the wind screamed across the snow-covered landscape, but inside that tent, the air was filled with something else, hope. Fragile, flickering hope. The dogs lay curled near the flap, still watching, refusing to leave their friend's side. And Officer Daniels remained by the cot, gripping that hand, silently promising that whatever happened next, Thomas would never be alone again. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas remained unresponsive in the sterile quiet of the hospital's ICU. His small body, wrapped in layers of white sheets, seemed almost fragile beneath the tubes and monitors that surrounded him. The rhythmic beeping of the machines was the only sound that broke the silence, each beep a painful reminder of how close he had come to the edge. Though his body lay still, there was a storm of emotion stirring in the hearts of those around him, especially Officer Daniels. Every single day, without fail, Daniels returned. He brought with him not just small comforts, a warm blanket, a book of short animal stories, or the fuzzy toy dog he had found in the shed, but also his presence. He sat by Thomas's bedside like a silent guardian, his broad shoulders hunched forward, eyes clouded with worry. Sometimes he spoke softly, telling stories of brave rescue dogs or reminiscing about silly moments from patrol. Other times, he simply sat in silence, listening to the soft whir of machines and the shallow sound of Thomas's breathing. Inside, Daniels was struggling. He couldn't erase the image of that freezing, dark shed, of Thomas curled up, silent and chained, next to a dog that had clearly been his only companion. The memory gnawed at him. He had seen trauma before, but this was different. This was a boy whose soul had been left in the cold too long, and Daniels didn't know if warmth could ever reach him again. But he had to try. The nurses noticed the routine. They called Daniels the silent shadow. And Thomas, though still unconscious, began showing small signs of resilience. His heart rate steadied. His breathing improved. "He's fighting," one nurse whispered. Somewhere deep down, he's fighting to stay. Outside the hospital window, the rescue dogs were kept in temporary care, but Rex, the dog who had been chained beside Thomas, seemed especially restless. Whenever Daniels visited, he'd bring Rex along. The old dog would sit by the window, staring in, his ears alert, his tail still. It was as if he were waiting for his friend to wake up. Their bond, forged in silence and snow, remained unbroken. Then one evening, as the sky outside turned from pale gold to deep blue, Daniels leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "You made it out, Thomas. I don't know how, but you did. And now you're not alone. We're all here. Me, Rex, we're not giving up on you." As if drawn by those words, Thomas's fingers gave the faintest twitch. Daniels froze, his breath caught in his throat. Slowly, Thomas's hand shifted again, curling weakly, just enough to feel human, alive. Daniels quickly took the small hand in his, eyes welling with tears. "Thomas? Can you hear me, buddy?" There was a long pause. Then, through dry, cracked lips, came a hoarse whisper. "It's cold." Daniel stood in shock for a moment, then shouted for the nurse, joy and fear crashing together in his chest. Thomas had spoken. It wasn't much, but it meant the world. After all the darkness, the silence, the pain, he had found his way back. And this time, Daniel swore, Thomas would never be cold again. The news that Thomas had finally opened his eyes traveled swiftly through the hospital like a quiet miracle. Nurses exchanged hopeful glances, and doctors walked with a little more urgency, their steps echoing with renewed purpose. After weeks of uncertainty, of machines beeping steadily in a sterile room, there was finally a sign of life, a flicker of hope where once there had only been fear. Officer Daniels was already at Thomas's side when the boy stirred, just as he had been every day since he was found. He had never stopped coming, not once. He sat in that same worn hospital chair for hours on end, speaking softly to the unconscious boy, reading books aloud, telling him stories about Rex, and occasionally just sitting in silence, as though his presence alone might pull Thomas back from whatever dark place his mind had retreated to. When Thomas's eyelids fluttered open, Daniels leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. "Thomas," he whispered. The boy's gaze wandered uncertainly around the room, unfocused and dazed, before landing on Daniels. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, Thomas blinked, and a tear slipped from the corner of his eye. It wasn't just physical exhaustion that clouded the boy's expression. There was something far deeper, a haunting mix of fear, confusion, and quiet sorrow. His lips parted slightly, as if to speak, but no words came out. Daniel saw it all in that moment, the weight of the trauma Thomas had endured, the scars that wouldn't show on scans, the silent questions he couldn't yet voice. Daniels reached out gently, his voice steady but soft. "You're safe now, buddy. It's over. No one's ever going to hurt you again." Thomas didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. That in itself felt like a breakthrough. When Rex was finally brought in, after being bathed and examined by a vet, the old dog padded into the room slowly, his joints stiff but his eyes alert. At the sound of his claws tapping the floor, Thomas's head turned sharply, eyes wide. "Rex," he whispered, his first word since waking up. The dog let out a low, comforting whine and approached the bed. Thomas reached out with trembling fingers and touched Rex's fur, as if needing to confirm he was real. Then, as the dog laid his head gently on the edge of the bed, Thomas collapsed into silent sobs, his small shoulders shaking with a grief that had been bottled up for far too long. Daniels turned away slightly, blinking rapidly to stop his own tears from falling. It wasn't just relief, it was heartbreak, fury at what had happened to this child, and fierce determination that it would never happen again. He made a promise in that moment, not just to himself, but to Thomas. In the following days, Daniels began the legal process of seeking guardianship. He fought every step of the way, arguing that Thomas should never be placed back into a system that had failed him so catastrophically. While therapists worked on the boy's mental recovery, it was the officer who gave him consistency, bringing him warm meals, telling him bedtime stories, and simply being there, day after day. Thomas rarely spoke, but he listened. And slowly, he began to trust. He'd grip Danielle's hand a little tighter during nightmares, whisper questions about Rex, or glance at the officer with quiet curiosity as if trying to understand why this man, who owed him nothing, had stayed. One evening, just before lights out, Thomas asked softly, "If I get better, will I still have to go away?" Daniels knelt beside the bed, looking him in the eye. "You're not going anywhere you don't want to go. Not as long as I can help it. You and Rex, you belong together. And if you want, you can belong with me too." A pause. Then a small nod from Thomas. That night, he slept peacefully for the first time since he'd been rescued.